Greetings and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. I'm Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, and I'm joined here by Dr. Michael Barber, my colleague here at the Graduate School of Theology at the Augustine Institute. That's right, and my friend. So we're talking about...
Formed.
Are you thirsty?
It says formed.
It says formed.
Yes. Augustine Institute's on this side. Anyway.
There we go.
All right.
What are we doing here? No, just kidding. Season 2, Episode 4. It's called The Perfect Opportunity. And in some ways, this is an episode that I really liked, I think, because some of what goes on here is what The Chosen sort of does best with the story that it crafts. Mm-hmm. A lot of which is not fully biblical. So where are we biblically in this?
Right. So most of this episode is coming out of John chapter 5. And we've already seen the story. We've already seen the portrayal in The Chosen of the healing of the man in John 5, who is revealed in The Chosen to be the brother of Simon the Zealot, as he's known in the New Testament. So what is going on here is basically an imaginative take on the backstory and on the ramifications of this miracle.
Right. So some of this background, which is, again, not scriptural, it's not in the Bible, they've just crafted it really around the way they imagine this character, Simon the Zealot.
Simon the Zealot and his brother Jesse, mm-hmm. who's healed, who was, as we see in this episode, a boy when he sustained this injury. He lost the use of his legs when he fell out of a tree. He was the victim of a number of tragedies. His mother died in giving birth to his brother. And so he longs for healing, and he ends up at this pool of Bethesda, where it's understood that there is some sort of divinity, some sort of spirit, an angel that seems to move the waters and enable people to be healed. And after, of course, he is healed in the story, the Pharisees condemn him because he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath and because Jesus is doing a work of performing a miracle. Now, this idea of it being wrong to carry your mat on the Sabbath is actually based in a biblical principle or biblical passage. Find it in the book of Jeremiah. If we can go to the slide here, Jeremiah 17, we read, "Thus says the Lord, for the sake of your lives, take care that you do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day or bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, and do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your ancestors." And so here we have the text that is sort of in the background, right? This is why the Pharisees are portrayed as condemning Jesus. And then Simon, who is being trained in the secretive order of the Zealots, which is all imaginative, right? He's like the Jack Bauer of the apostles, right? He's specially trained, black ops, whatever. He knows how to use a knife, all this stuff. He's about to carry out well, I guess in movies they would call this a hit. He's about to carry out an assassination.
What Michael's trying to convey is that this is very dramatic, right? In the story, it is dramatic. It's amped up, and this is one of the things that I thought was creative and almost kind of fun about it is these two brothers who've been separated because Z goes off to train to await the Messiah to help prepare for that. Jesse goes to the pool looking for healing, and after this training, these stories are woven back together in a very creative way, such that at the high point, seeing his healed brother is what stops Simon the Zealot's sort of assassination attempt, right? And so the threads of the story are woven back together, and we see that happen in a clip that we've pulled out for you. So let's take a quick look at that. So what I think comes out nicely in this is especially the note that Simon leaves his brother, basically saying that he's awaiting the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, he'll be able to heal him, and on that day, everything will change. And that's kind of what we see transpire in this moment in the episode.
Now, if we're in the world of the chosen, the idea is the zealots believe that the Messiah is a political figure who is going to overthrow the Romans. And so it's hard for me to understand in the story why Z thinks that now that the Messiah has come, there's something more important than taking violent action, because it would seem that seeing his brother healed would only further propel him to carry out the assassination. But I think here we have a powerful note, and that is in recognizing that his brother has been healed, he sees that compassion has been shown to his brother. And that seems to strike a note in him. It seems to, even though he still imagines after this that he is to be engaged in combat against the Romans, it seems, at least for a moment, to quell those fires, or that's not the right word, but to, dampen that spirit of murder, if you will. I'm mixing metaphors left and right here. It's been a long day. We're grading papers this week, so we're really busy. But I will just say that I thought that was powerful, this idea that his brother has been shown compassion, he has been transformed, and now something is going to change in an unexpected way in his own life.
Right, and I think we'll continue to see that develop. So as we focus on kind of the scene a little bit surrounding this healing, Jesse is there waiting. We see him actually try, untold number of times throughout the years, as it's kind of portrayed in a condensed, time frame there, trying to enter the waters. And it's interesting, right, about how this is and is not related to the Gospel of John.
Right. So in the Gospel of John, we have the story of the healing, and there is a verse 4, that is not in the original manuscripts of John. So it seems to have been added later. And this is what we read in John chapter 5. Now, in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, or it could be Bethesda or Bethsaida, different manuscripts have different expressions there, which is 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed. Now, this is where older manuscripts insert something. It says that they were waiting for the stirring of the water for an angel of the Lord. Now, this is not in the original texts of the New Testament, but it does get included in older English translations of the Bible. So you may know this verse if you've been reading the King James Version or the RSV version, the old RSV version. You would expect this to be part of the text. We know this is most likely added to the story. And so it was interesting to me what the producers of The Chosen did. They allude to this idea that there's some kind of spirit that stirs up the water through Simon. Simon mentions this angel theory, but he dismisses it as a kind of pagan perception, which makes sense. There might be some evidence that this pool of Bethesda had some kind of pagan associations. So I thought it was really clever what they did. They took a text that people are familiar with. Many people, I would imagine, know this verse that is not now in more recent English translations of the Bible, because we know it was most likely in the original text. But nonetheless, they incorporated it into the story somehow.
Yeah, they often do that, right? Where there's something that's either a different manuscript tradition, or something that's in non-canonical historical sources, and they find creative ways to weave it in, which I appreciate. And I like too how in the kind of purity of Simon's, zealotry, if you will, he immediately condemns, right, the kind of pagan part of this story. But that raises questions again about kind of the zealots and that
right. And it's really, like I've said before, it's unclear if the zealots existed in Jesus's day. Josephus does gives some indication they might have been around, but most scholars think that the Zealots really arose around the time of the Jewish War, which would have been decades after Jesus. Simon in the episode refers to it as the fourth philosophy. That is a description for Zealots that comes right out of the writing of that Jewish historian, Josephus. But Josephus probably isn't speaking in the way other Jews of his day were. He's trying to describe the Jewish landscape, if you will, the Jewish culture of his day in terms that Greco-Roman readers would understand. And so he describes the different sects, the different groups in Judaism as different philosophical schools, because that was what was common in Greco-Roman context. So, of course, The Chosen picks that up and puts it in Simon's mouth, but I don't really think that's historically plausible. But
so that's kind of the context of that scene there, just to give some of the background. Involved here in many different scenes and kind of ways is a character that I, kind of like as he's introduced here, Atticus. Mm-hmm. And the other Roman centurions see him, mm-hmm. and they point out, with kind of respect and awe, mm-hmm. a little bit, I think, that he's a member of the cohortes urbanae, kind of soldiers loyal to Caesar and the city of Rome. And, I think there are some questions about the real role there. He comes out across like, a special agent almost. And maybe there's something a little bit like that if the FBI is like the federal, level of a police force. Maybe there's something to that. I find it very amusing that he seems to always be snacking on something. He always seems to have some food in his hand and he's nibbling. But the fun thing to think about, as we see him is what role will he play, right? Sure. Will he develop into one of the Roman characters we see converting in the Gospels or not? And so whenever there's a character kind of introduced, it's fun. And you've done this in a really fun way. I can't wait to see how some of these play out. But to think about where might they factor into the gospel story or even maybe Acts of the Apostles later on. So Atticus will be a fun character, I think, to watch. My
theory, I'm going to put this on camera because it's falsifiable. So, and it will be falsified. I'm almost nearly sure. But my theory is that he's going to play some role in Judas's betrayal of Jesus. But I don't know yet how that's going to work out. But I think it's going to go that direction. But I could be wrong. We shall see.
We shall see. All right, so let's talk about, again, some more context here. Feast of Tabernacles, right? Let's take a look at a clip where they talk a little bit about this feast.
I've never been to Jerusalem. Really? How is that possible? My father never took me and my mother to the feasts.
This is your first Feast of the Tabernacles?
No, this is just my first time in Jerusalem.
Tabernacle is a temporary dwelling.
It's a tent.
I know what the tabernacle is. So what? Do we have to build one to eat?
Mm-hmm.
I was being facetious.
God said to live in a booth for 7 days during this feast, to commemorate how the children of Israel lived in temporary shelters for 40 years in the desert.
Still out.
One of 3 pilgrimage holidays where every able-bodied Israelite male who traveled to Jerusalem can present himself before Adonai. You really don't know about any of this stuff.
I've already admitted that I don't know all of it. I didn't pay much attention. I do recall my father used to leave 3 times a year.
Why is it only the men are required to go?
It can be a perilous journey, difficult for children and the sick, people who need caretakers, but it doesn't prohibit anyone. I've taken Eden many times.
All right, so they discuss this feast among themselves. Mary Magdalene mentions that this is her first time going up to Jerusalem, and she also wonders why only men are required, according to the Torah, to go up to Jerusalem. I really don't think that many first century, if any, first century Jewish women had this instinct that, well, wait a minute, this only applies to men? It doesn't apply to us as well? For lots of sociological reasons. That being said, by giving us this scene, the producers are helping us enter into the gospel story, because elsewhere in the gospels, not here in the gospel narrative, but also in the gospels, I'm thinking of John chapter 7, Jesus does go up for the Feast of Tabernacles. And as Big James points out, it's one of the 3 major pilgrimage feasts with Passover and Pentecost, where Jewish men were required to go up to the temple. Now, that being said, since we know that there are 3 major festivals, this raises chronology questions for me, and I've been highlighting some of these as we've gone along. I know it's hard to hear me in the abstract, so let's go to the slide this time. I keep meaning to put this in a visual presentation. So Season 2, Episode 1, informs us that all of Season 1 took place in the month of Adar. All right, so that's February, March. Okay? Season 2, Episodes 1 through 3, take place in the immediate backdrop of Season 1. So, February to April, somewhere in there, okay? Season 2, Episode 4, where we are today, puts us at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles happens in September, October. So here we're about 6 months later than where we were in just the previous episode. And Mary Magdalene tells us in this episode, or at least she's portrayed as saying this is her first time in Jerusalem. Now, I've raised questions about whether the women would have followed Jesus to all these places like Mary Magdalene and Rama actually do in the show. But let's just say for a second that Mary Magdalene is to be understood as going everywhere Jesus' disciples go with Jesus, following him around. My question is, when did they go up for Passover or Pentecost? So it seems like there's a real gap here in the story. They should have gone up for the feast of Passover and or Pentecost, which were pilgrimage feasts. So for Mary Magdalene to say here, oh, I've never been up to Jerusalem before, just is a little puzzling to me. Maybe we'll see that the producers fill out the details in some way that I don't understand. But just wanted to mention that, just kind of highlight it and raise a question.
Yeah, I mean, she does say that she hasn't been, which doesn't rule out the others going, but if they're traveling together, so there are some questions here. It'll be interesting to see.
And does it really feel like, 6 months have passed since the last episode? I don't know. Yeah. Maybe it does. Just throwing it out there.
Yeah. So point about chronology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll raise a point about meteorology.
Yeah.
No, not sort of that. And it's captured in our next clip, which we'll play for you here.
With all due respect, Nathaniel, I know you're a skilled architect, but this thatched roof won't keep the rain out.
That's the point. The vegetation provides shade from the sun during the day.
And if a few raindrops get through, it is a reminder of our dependence on God, of his provision, and of how our people were so vulnerable in the wilderness. And he brought us through.
There was a time in my life, in my old life, where I had to sleep outside. It is a good reminder of how I was delivered from that.
This time of dwelling in booths is also a leveler of people. Wealthy, poor, everyone sleeps outside as equals.
Well, let's be honest. Not all booths are created equal.
Yes, Nathaniel, the beauty of this booth is itself an act of worship.
So it has to do with the weather. That was my attempt at a joke. And this comment, they're looking at this structure that they've built, the tabernacle. And Matthew, who is, again, sort of not up to speed quite on all of these things, points out that the roof blocks the sun, but, rain can still get through. And again, I like that these next words are put in Mary's mouth, Mary, the mother of Jesus. She points out that the roof provides shade, but it can also let through some of the rain, right? And that this is a reminder of their dependence on God, on his provision. And, what comes through is that they remain vulnerable.
Right.
And what I think is fascinating about this, there's a kind of image, I think, for faith and the spiritual life here. There's so much in our lives that we construct, right? Like our schedule, our kind of Christian practices and devotions. But we would do well, I think, to kind of take this lesson from the roof, the thatch roof, of preparing for and allowing some discomfort or dependence on God into our lives. As Catholics, right, fasting is one way that we do this. To fast is to not have quite as much or not have exactly what we otherwise would want, right? And in that, to remind ourselves that God is most important, that God provides for us. So, I think there's a neat image here, just as a reminder for an important dimension of the Christian life, which is we have, through our human ingenuity and arts and crafts, we have the ability to construct, perfectly non-porous roofs in so many areas of our lives, right? But to realize that there's actually a value and a significance to allowing some porosity, in the things that we build, in the parts of our lives that we construct and make up, to remind ourselves that in spite of all of our comforts, in spite of all that we have, we ultimately do remain dependent on God. And although we can't actually run from that, we can try to run from that and become overly kind of self-sufficient and forget our need for God. So this, I thought, was a really a great reminder in that particular scene. There's a kind of human faith element there.
You brought out another element of this when along a similar trajectory. We were talking about this episode, and you had a really important insight. A scene stood out to you. It's where Nathaniel is speaking to Thomas, and he's explaining to Thomas that although this is uncomfortable for him, he's actually a lot more like Matthew, who he has been critical of. He's a lot more like Matthew than he realizes. And what was it that you said about that?
I was amused by that, and because it brings out another kind of human lesson of Nathaniel is basically pointing out when Thomas is expressing his dislike, and discomfort with regard to Matthew. Nathaniel's basic point is, you two are very similar, and that was, it's just such a human situation that, often the people that we might be tempted to judge or who might rub us in the wrong way or annoy us, sometimes it's because they're like us, And I think it's just a good lesson there. And I think this comes through in a couple of moments in a helpfully humorous and amusing way, that we should just, give people a little grace and a little room, and realize that if we're tempted to kind of jump on someone or get annoyed, sometimes it's because it points to something in ourselves. And that should, instead of leading to annoyance, it should actually deepen our sense of understanding and our willingness to forgive. And so that was another human lesson that kind of
It's really funny when you're a parent, you see this much more clearly than when you were a child, because you see your own children do this.
Yeah.
Right? Your children will critique their siblings, and it's often the case that you want to say, could the kettle be calling the pot any more black? I mean, you do the exact same thing. So there's the kid who doesn't make his bed, who's unorganized, telling the sibling, your room is a disaster. What are you talking about? But I think it's funny when I experience that as a parent, I often reflect on how God, as my father, often must look at me and see me doing something similar. Yeah. And so when you highlighted that, I thought that was really a poignant observation. I like that the producers of The Chosen made a point of going in that direction. I appreciated that. I also really appreciated the way the disciples talking amongst themselves, and just the characters in The Chosen talking amongst themselves, highlight in their various dialogues the way Christ is the one, whether it's Mary Magdalene talking about how Jesus came to her and she first encountered Jesus, or whether it's Jesse and Simon, how we constantly get this idea that Christ is the solution to our plight. Let's take a look at a clip where that is on display. Clip number 4.
That's not what I asked. I'm not asking you about who's helping you, or who's not helping, or who's getting in your way. I'm asking about you. I've tried. For a long time, I know. And you don't want false hope again, I understand. But this pool, it has nothing for you. It means nothing. And you know it. But you're still here. Why? I don't know. You don't need this pool. You only need me.
So in this clip, it brings us to, kind of the climactic moment of the healing. And Jesus approaches Jesse. And what was striking to me in his talking to him, which I really liked this moment of dialogue, actually, because, as you said, Christ is sort of the solution. And the question is sort of like, what is the problem, And sin is always the problem. But here, what becomes clear is how Jesse seems to lack hope. And Christ arrives as the fulfillment of hope. And, even in commentary on this scene in Scripture, he's been waiting here for 38 years or whatever it is. And there's supposed to be a parallel here with the life of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And so I think, in a way, Jesse is a symbol for the Jewish people, and even more broadly for all of us, all of humanity, because Jesus is sort of saying, why have you been here so long? And Jesse talks about, well, I've been trying so hard, but nobody will carry me. I'm unable, mm-hmm. right? And try as we might, right? Whether it's the chosen people, whether it's all of humanity, there's a bridge that we are unable to cross on our own. Mm-hmm. That healing that we seek, that hope that we seek, we can't achieve that on our own, right? And so there's this waiting for the true hope. There's this waiting for the bridge. There's this waiting for the solution, and that solution is Christ, mm-hmm. right? And that came through really beautifully. And I like too, there's this touch of when Jesus sort of says, so why are you still here? Mm-hmm. And I thought about how many ways when we've actually kind of lost hope in a certain sense, we can cling instead to comfort, meaning like the comfort of the familiar. I don't know if this is in the minds of the writers of The Chosen, but why is Jesse still there? He might be hopeless, but this is all that he knows at this point, right? Mm-hmm. That familiarity, cling to the familiarity as a sort of substitute for hope. I don't know. And I think there's a kind of psychological dimension here that we can imagine, or many of us have maybe experienced. And so again, to have a renewed and restored sense of hope when Jesus comes as the one who's able to heal us, right? We can't bring that to ourselves, but he can bring it. He is our hope. That I thought came through really, really nicely in this scene. Mm-hmm. Another dimension here that I think you kind of cued me into was the role that John the Apostle plays. And we have mm-hmm. the continuation, actually, of the clip we just saw, and John kind of factors in here. So let's take a look at that clip.
So, do you want to be healed? So let's go. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk.
I'm free to walk, like he said. Don't forget your bed.
So what's interesting here is that we see John taking notes at the scene of Jesus's miraculous sign and the fallout from it. In an earlier episode, in season 1, John is sort of eavesdropping as Jesus is talking with Nicodemus. Once again, he's taking notes. What I found amusing is, of course, both of these episodes are found only in the Gospel of John, right? So the idea is, all right, John the Apostle is the author of the 4th Gospel, and John the Apostle is writing notes to himself down. And by the way, that's not entirely implausible. They would have these wax tablets that people would write on. I don't think he would carry around a notebook as it's presented sort of in The Chosen. That would have been far more expensive and unlikely. In fact, teachers expected their students to memorize their words. And so it seems likely the apostles would have maybe used some devices like wax tablets. Craig Keener's New Testament scholar points this out, to help remember things. But then they would have erased it and rewritten once they committed these things to memory. But since we have cell phones, we don't need memory anymore. So we can't imagine people memorizing stuff unless you're an actor and you remember all the lines, right, that you have to perform. Now, in the backdrop of this episode is a passage from the book of Zephaniah. And we actually hear it read in the background at one point. Now, I got some translation questions about this. I'm not going to get nerdy about all of it, but the key idea in this section of Zephaniah is that God is going to, quote unquote, save the lame. If we go to a slide here, we've got Zephaniah 3:19, and we read there, I will deal with all your oppressors at that time, and I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. So the idea here is that there will be a future age in which God addresses the needs of the lame, and Jesus is portrayed, of course, as fulfilling that hope in the scene.
Yeah, and when we see John kind of, taking his notes, just two kind of quick thoughts on that. One is, we did see in an earlier episode that John, they portrayed John as the older John after Jesus' death, and he's writing things because some things only he witnessed, or and Matthew wasn't there, and so in some of these special scenes, it kind of aligns with that. So there's, at least within the way that The Chosen has been designed, there's a kind of continuity there that I want to acknowledge. But I think just to your point, there's a little bit. You and I have talked about this before, where we have a little bit of a concern that the gospel writers become kind of like, transcription machines or something, where it's just, taking down the facts and...
just facts, ma'am.
Exactly.
Just facts.
And it's not that the Gospels aren't factual, but it kind of just misses the bigger point, and the more important point, that the Gospel writers are human beings and created by God and have certain gifts, and they use those gifts in how they put things together. And of course, we could see what John is doing as kind of the pre-materials that will later get assembled and collated and all these things. But just want to avoid the impression that it's a mere kind of
journalistic account.
Exactly, right? It goes beyond journalism, and it's nice to see moments where that comes through rather than the kind of the journalistic mere scribe type moment.
Now, there are other things in this episode that I could harp on. We read that Simon is about to assassinate this magistrate, and there's a line in there where he's going to have to cancel his reservation at his favorite restaurant. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, Oh my goodness, this is quite anachronistic. But I won't say too much about that. Let's move to the last clip here, where we see Jesus explain to his disciples why he performed this miracle. There's a question here, right? And that is, the disciples realize, could have caused yourself a lot less grief if you just waited for the sun to go down.
With the Pharisees.
Right, with the Pharisees, the man could have picked up the mat. It wouldn't have been the Sabbath day. Everything would have been hunky-dory. Wait a minute. You meant to do it. You meant to cause this kind of controversy. Let's take a look at this clip. It's clip number 6, guys.
Waiting 30 more minutes wouldn't have mattered to that man. Why did you do this on Shabbat? Sometimes you gotta stir up the water.
Scott, sometimes you gotta stir up the water.
And you've got to lose your accent while saying the line sometimes, I guess. But this is one of those moments. It actually, it's just one of those moments where I can't square it with how I think about Jesus in the Gospels. And part of the reason is there's this idea of being a rebel, and the music and the posture and the, stride out seem to go in that direction, which is a very, kind of modern phenomenon. Like sometimes you just gotta be a rebel, basically, and, stir things up. And I don't know, I like to think that in the divine counsel of God, there's more at work, and the reasons are more and manifold and deeper and more beautiful than sort of just stirring things up, But, it's a little thing, but it's an interesting portrayal of Jesus there.
There's also the sense that Jesus was especially keen on performing this miracle once he discovered that Shmuel was in the city, this Pharisee who has that out for Jesus. And I understand that Jesus is portrayed throughout the Gospels as countering expectations, as subverting the norms of the world. But at the same time, it's always for a deeper purpose than just, I'm going to really bother them. There's a pedagogy here. There's a goal here. And so I would have liked to have had more of a sense of that in this scene. But anyway.
Yeah. So, one thing that I think comes through in all of these different moments that we've kind of commented on is a theme we've come back to, that there's a lot of complexity at work. We talked about, Atticus is a Roman soldier, sort of. We see other Roman soldiers here. We see the Pharisees. We see some pagan influence. We see the Zealots. We see, and I hope that
can be helpful.
Yeah, that can be helpful. And I hope that in commenting on this, again, it opens up new vistas for you, as I think it has in some ways for us.
Sure.
Going back to the Gospels and encountering Christ there. And so our hope is always that our comments, whether positive or critical, can just give us a greater appreciation for the Jesus of the Gospels.
You mentioned vistas. We frequently drive as a family from Colorado to California. A number of times a year we make this trip back and forth. And along the way, there are all these places to stop where you can see the mountain range, you can see things. And I gotta say, we've made this trip many times over the last 6 years. Every time we make those trips and we go over the Colorado Rockies and we go over other mountain ranges, it's amazing to me how I see new things, right? And if that's true of the terrain of the world, how much more true is it for the Gospels? And so, yes, I can be in particular critical of The Chosen, but I do appreciate that it sends me back to the Scriptures, makes me think about them more deeply. And of course, we have a deeper appreciation for the truths that we find there and the mysteries that we encounter. So hopefully that is your experience as well.
So we wish you well and many blessings on your adventure through the terrain of Scripture. And we hope that this is helpful to you. Take care and God bless.